Okay, welcome to part 1 of this tutorial series. In this video we are going to be explaining the database folder structure, database and folder structure that is, and creating the table and start making a start on the API sort of back-end stuff. We'll also be making a few small modifications to the current code that we have. If you don't know already, then go and watch part 1, part 0. But what we're doing is basically sort of adding to the URL shortening tutorial that I previously uploaded last week, that was. So yeah, we're going to be starting from that, with that code base already in place, and just sort of adding to it with the API things. Making one small modification to the init file. The other pages and backend function for the shortener will be unchanged. So basically to test this you're going to need that code, so yeah, you need to watch my other video if you haven't already. Anyway, let's get started. This is the page that we're going to be creating, by the way, this api.php. But I'll explain that in a moment. I'll do the database first. So this is the database for the URL shortening site. If I just browse the page, browse the URLs database, you see we have 4 URLs in there already. They were probably, I don't know, part of last video's testing. Anyway, not going to be doing anything to that table. We're just going to be creating a new table called API log with 3 fields. This table is going to contain sort of the date and the IP address, and sort of an integer count of a number of requests that IP address has made using our API on that date. The reason we're doing this is so we can prevent the thing that I showed you in part 0, where someone could just fill up our database with nonsense very easily, because obviously we don't want that. We want to keep the amount of sort of the use of the API to a minimum, a reasonable minimum. I mean, you could offer like a premium service that you have to pay for, where you get unlimited access to the API without this limit, but that's not something we're going to be covering in this video anyway. Right, so these 3 fields, the first one is an IP address, the second one is the date, and the third one is the number of requests, which we're just going to call requests. So the IP address we're going to be storing as a sort of encoded integer. There's a mathematical operation that does this. MySQL has a function for it, but I'll explain that when we get to the backend file. So the type the type is int, and the length we're going to set as 10. For date, we're going to set the type to date, nothing to the length, and requests we're going to set the type that to int as well, and we're going to set the length to 4. So I previously mentioned that we're going to set the limit to 1000, which is of length 4. What was I saying? Right, so that's that. One thing we do need to do is well, actually, I should just say first, we're not going to be defining any indexes here. We're not going to be setting any of these, because we're going to set an index on 2 columns in a moment, and I'll explain that when we do that. We just can't do that using this screen, so I have to do that in a minute. One thing we do need to do is set attributes to unsigned for this IP. The reason for that is the method we use to encode the IP address to a number, convert I should say, not encode, anyway. The method we use to do that needs to create some very large numbers, larger in fact than the limit of a signed integer in MySQL. So we just need to specify that we want this to be unsigned. You don't have to worry particularly too much about what that means. It's quite a technical thing, but yeah, we just basically to be able to use numbers larger than, I've forgotten the number, but some, you need to use unsigned. Okay, so we're just going to hit save, which will create this table. Not right click on it. So that's to create the table. You see we get this warning saying no index defined. So we're just going to define a new index. It's going to be on 2 columns. So we're just going to hit go on 2. And we're just going to give it the name of unique, just because I can't really think of anything else. And the fields are going to be the IP and the date. The reason, well, actually I'll try and explain this in a moment. Let's just hit save. So that's been created. So now we have lost that warning telling us not to be silly. Okay, the way this works, this unique index on both of these columns, is that it will not allow the same value sort of for the combination of this column to be used on more than one row. Like say if you have a primary key or a unique index, sorry, a primary index, it won't let you use that value more than once in the table. This won't let you use the pair of values more than once in the table. So just think of it like that. If you think of it, if you sort of struggling to understand, think of joining the value of this onto this, and then that has to be unique. So you can have the same IP on two dates, or the same date with lots of IPs, but you can't have the same IP on the same date on multiple rows. So that's why we need to do that, because that's a requirement that we have. We're going to be counting the number of requests, not logging each request in a new row. Okay, so what we're going to do now is talk about the folder structure. And what that is basically the structure of the folders. So let's just go back up to the root of this tutorial that we're working in. We have these two folders, sorry. We have shortening site, which contains the code to the URL shortener, most of it anyway. Well, all of it, and then some more. And then this other site is just to simulate like another website, something that wouldn't have access to these files. So this folder won't be using any of the files from this folder. Inside the shortening site, we have these two pages that we had previously, but now we've added this API.php page. If I just go to the API page, you see this currently has no PHP code. We're creating this whole script. It doesn't have any HTML either, because this is just a backend. Well, it's not a backend file. All it does is output sort of encoded data. It doesn't display anything to the browser, so we're not going to be having any HTML in here. So yeah, that's that. Sorry, excuse me. Right, what were we talking about? Just directory structure. We've added one another file to this. If we go into the core folder in the shortening site, then the ink, we've added this API backend, which again is currently blank. So if we go, everything else is unchanged. So if we go all the way back up to our root, I mean these two pages will still work. I'll demonstrate that as well actually. Say if I go to, well there you go, this is a blank page currently, just demonstrate that. If I go to shorten and specify a URL like http:// Google, hit shorten, you see we get this URL, and if I browse to this, it redirects me to Google, so it'll still work. So the URL shortener is still functional. There haven't been any modifications to its code at all, and we won't be talking about its code at all either. We're just going to be talking about the API code. So that's that. What else to say? Oh yeah, the other site folder. What this folder contains is a single test page, which at the moment anyway, it contains a simple HTML template, just the standard doc type and just this. And then we also have this API interface file. What this file is a file that you will offer for download on your website. So this isn't something that you'll host on your site. You'll just offer it up for download, and people can download it, and it'll help them interface with your API in PHP. So they don't have to worry about sort of the sockets themselves. We do all that for them in this file. I'll explain what sockets are in part 4 or 5. So that's pretty much it for the introduction. The folder structure in the database, that is, sorry. So what we are going to do is create we're going to move on and create the backend file for the API, and then modify this init file if we get time. So starting left to right, we're going to make the backend API file. This file is going to provide two functions. Both those functions are going to perform two tasks, obviously. The first task is to log an API request. So we're just going to call that this function log API request. It's going to take one parameter, which is going to be the IP, which we're logging a request for, and then it's going to do some things. So I'm going to comment what this function does. Let's just say it logs a request for the given IP address, and let's spell everything right. Amazing. Okay, so the second function we're going to be creating here is one that gets the number of API requests on the current day, today basically, which I haven't thought of a better name for this, but we're going to call it get today's API requests. It's a bit of a faff for a name, but never mind. Again, it takes one parameter, which is the IP address, and that is the IP that we are getting the number of requests for. Let's just comment what this does. Gets the total number of requests that have been made today. So that's that done. These are the sort of two definitions of this function. Of these functions, I should say. Learn to speak. Okay, so this function is by far the most complicated, so let's do that first. Well, the query. I'm actually going to do a basics video on the most complicated part of this query, the on duplicate key update syntax. But yeah, I'll explain that in a moment. So the IP address, first it needs to be escaped, because this comes from the user. Well, it could potentially come from the user anyway. So IP equals MySQL real escape string. I'm just going to escape the IP address, like so. If you don't know what that does, watch my video on SQL injection, because you may need to do something else here, strip slashes namely, but I don't do that because I don't have magic quotes on my system. So yep, if you don't have magic quotes on, don't need to worry about it. If you do, turn it off. If you can't, strip slashes. That's the basics of it, but go watch my video on it. They'll explain in lovely detail. Anyway, let's define, because the query is quite long, we're going to put it in this SQL variable, be equal to a string, and that's going to be insert, the query, sorry, it's going to be insert into table name, which was API log, the list of values, which was IP, the date, and the number of requests, and then the values we're going to be inserting are something, which is the result of the iNetAton function. What that does is takes a string, and that string parameter is the user's or the IP address. You know, a 4-digit like 20. That's the IP address of my computer on the local network that I'm running here. So that's an IP address. And what that does is does like a mathematical operation. It's quite complicated. Well, it's not complicated, but it's not something we need to talk about here. So if you don't know what that is and you want to know, you can easily look it up. But it converts the IP address into an integer that we can store, and it's a little bit smaller. It's nicer than storing a string because integers are quicker to work with. You can compare them as integers, like you can see if something is less than the given value, but we won't be doing that because we don't really need to. But yeah, it's just sort of a nice way to store an IP address. The second parameter to go in the date column is just going to be the now function, which will just store the date. The now function actually returns the current time, but when you're inserting it, it will trim it off and just insert the date part. And then finally, the number of requests is going to be 0, because if we're inserting a row, they haven't made a request yet, otherwise the row would already be there. Because remember, the IP address and date has to be unique. So if the day has just changed over to tomorrow, then we want to insert a new row for that date and start them off with 0 requests for that day. So now comes the tricky part, or the interesting part, you could say, the on duplicate key update, sort of keywords. What this does is, if a key duplication has occurred, i.e. if you're trying to insert the same combination of IP and date that is already in the table, it will run this update query. Syntax is slightly different, so it's requests. You don't have to specify you don't use the set keyword, and you don't have to specify the table again. So requests equals requests plus 1. You also don't have to specify any where stuff, because it gets to the row you're trying to update from this information, so it sort of knows the row already. Sort of running out of time a bit, but I'll explain this a little bit more in the next part, so join me for that, and we'll basically finish off this file and start creating the API page. Okay, thanks for watching, and join me in part 2.